The life we live plays an ironic trick on all of us. When we are young, we believe we have all the time in the world, but as maturity arrives, society convinces us that time is running out. It makes us believe that after 40, everything begins to decline. The success, the beauty, the dreams. As if, from a certain point onward, all that remains is to accept routine and wait for old age. But what if it were exactly the opposite? What if the first 40 years were just a rehearsal, a preparation for something much greater? The modern world reinforces the idea that youth is the pinnacle of life, the moment when we are most beautiful, desirable, and relevant. Magazines, movies, advertisements, everything conspires to convince us that after 30, we start to lose value, like an outdated product, especially women, but that's a topic for another video. So, what if everything we've been taught about aging is wrong? Carl Jung believed that life has two halves. The first 40 years of life are, most of the time, dedicated to building the persona, as Carl Jung called the social mask we wear to fit in and meet others' expectations. Since childhood, we grow up believing that happiness is always one step ahead. The diploma, the job, the marriage, the recognition. The promise is clear. Follow this path and one day you will be completely happy. Therefore, we develop this identity to be accepted, valued, and to align with what we have learned about what it means to be successful. And this isn't necessarily bad. This period of learning and adaptation is necessary to understand how the world works. But there is a price. Often we distance ourselves from who we really are. We become prisoners of an identity built for others, not for ourselves. In the second half of life, we have the chance to break free and discover who we really are. The problem is that we've been conditioned to fear this process. While Western cultures treat aging as decline, many Eastern and indigenous traditions consider it evolution. In Japan, for example, the wabi-sabi philosophy teaches that beauty lies in impermanence and the marks of time. For indigenous peoples, elders are guardians of wisdom, not disposable figures. So why in the West has aging become almost taboo? The answer lies in the cult of the ego. In the first half of life, we are trained to define ourselves by what we achieve: degrees, money, appearance. When these things begin to change over time, we enter into crisis. Hence the question arises, are we being taught to seek the right things? Imagine life as a grand theatre. In the early acts, we are actors dedicated to playing the roles assigned to us. We learn early on that we need to be someone, to have an identity, status, a recognizable purpose. Thus, we spend decades building this character. We study to have a good career, seek recognition, accumulate assets, and earn titles. But Jung warns us that this phase is governed by the ego. The ego wants validation, wants to be seen, wants to prove its worth to the world. So we strive to follow the script we were handed. We work tirelessly to buy things that make us feel good, achieve goals that make us proud, and meet expectations that often aren't even ours. The problem? The ego is never satisfied. No matter how many goals are achieved, there will always be another one. Modern society feeds this endless cycle of achievements, as if life were a ladder that needs to be climbed without rest. The result is a generation of people who, despite appearing successful, feel an inexplicable emptiness. And here's the irony. The script we followed so faithfully in our youth was written to imprison us, not to free us. So, what happens when, after so many years following this script, we realise that something isn't right? At some point, something changes. It might be at 35, 40, or even after 50. Sometimes it arises as a subtle discomfort, an inexplicable boredom. Other times it's an intense crisis, a divorce, a dismissal, an emotional breakdown. Suddenly, things that once seemed important lose their luster. What once motivated now seems meaningless. Society calls this the midlife crisis. But Carl Jung described this moment as the beginning of the individuation process, the path to becoming who we truly are, beyond the character we've created. It's a call to leave behind the illusions of the past and awaken to a more authentic life, integrating all parts of ourselves, including those we've repressed over the years. The problem is that not everyone accepts this call. Many try to ignore it by diving even deeper into work, accumulating more material goods, or forcing a return to youth. This is because the ego resists, making us believe that we are losing something, that we are falling behind. In reality, what we are losing is merely the illusion, because the problem was never age. It was the fragile construction of identity. The persona you've built until now no longer represents who you really are. And here comes a fundamental concept: the shadow. Everything you've hidden, fears, desires, insecurities, stifled ambitions, remains within you, waiting to be acknowledged. Ignoring this shadow only leads to frustration and resentment. But when we face it, we discover that it holds an essential part of our authenticity. Individuation doesn't mean throwing everything away or rejecting the past. On the contrary, it's about taking everything you've lived, all your experiences, and using them as a foundation to rebuild yourself more truthfully. The good news? All the answers are already within you. You just need to be willing to ask the right questions. And when that happens, something changes. Suddenly you realize that you no longer want to live to meet expectations. Now what matters is something much greater: finding a true meaning for your existence. When the script of the first half of life no longer makes sense, what's the next chapter? Every real transformation comes with discomfort. After all, change means letting go of certainties, abandoning old habits, and most importantly, facing truths we've avoided for a long time. That's why many people resist this phase. It's easier to cling to the safety of the known than to dive into the unknown. But the price of stagnation is high: dissatisfaction, frustration, and the constant feeling that something is missing. Carl Jung said, "What you resist persists." The more we run from the call for change, the more life places us in the same situations, the same crises, until we finally decide to face them. The good news is that you don't need a grand revolution to start this transformation. Many believe that they need to take a huge leap, quit everything, start from scratch, change radically. But the most powerful changes often begin in the details. With determination, little by little, you can build a life that makes sense to you. For example, question your choices, reevaluate what truly matters, strengthen genuine connections, and most importantly, instead of repressing old passions and interests, reclaim what makes you feel alive. It could be art, writing, music, sports, spirituality, anything that brings a sense of authenticity and purpose. These small changes create a ripple effect. The more you allow yourself to live according to your essence, the clearer your path becomes. Remember that true freedom is not in avoiding the discomfort of change, but in accepting it as an essential part of growth. And with that, science helps you. If you think this midlife transformation is purely psychological, know that it also has a biological basis. Studies show that over the years, the brain undergoes changes that directly impact how we deal with life. During youth, we are more impulsive and reactive, as our brain is focused on exploring, conquering, and competing. But after 40, something interesting happens. We develop greater emotional regulation and a broader view of life. This occurs because the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and self-control, strengthens. At the same time, the amygdala, which generates intense emotional responses, tends to react with less impulsivity. In other words, our mind starts to favour clarity and reflection over reactivity. That's why many people, upon reaching this phase, feel a greater need to seek meaning instead of simply chasing external achievements. The brain starts to prioritise deep connections, authentic experiences, and a better balance between reason and emotion. But this transition doesn't happen automatically. Those who cling to the past and resist change may end up trapped in old patterns, living in fear of what no longer makes sense. On the other hand, those who embrace this transformation begin to make decisions more aligned with their internal values. And that choice makes all the difference. Because in the end, the question isn't about aging, but about how you choose to live the years you still have. Again, imagine life as a theatre divided into two acts. In the first, we are frantic actors, trying to memorize lines, play roles, and impress the audience. We live under the spotlight, worried about every detail of our performance. But then, the second act begins. The lighting changes. The stage no longer seems so threatening. Now, we no longer need to act. We can simply be. This is the gift that time gives us. the freedom to live without the obsession over others' gaze. The problem is that we've been taught to see this phase as a decline when, in reality, it is an ascension. Yes, the body changes, but what do we gain in return? Wisdom, depth, authenticity. What once worried us, status, appearance, approval, starts to lose importance. It's like leaving a noisy party and finally being able to hear your own thoughts. Do not resist this transition. Do not fight against time, clinging to the past, fearing the future. Jung teaches us that life has a natural flow, and fighting against it is the true source of suffering. When we accept the passage of time, not as an enemy, but as a teacher, something magical happens. Anxiety diminishes, pressure disappears, and for the first time, we experience what it means to live authentically. At 20, you thought you knew everything. At 30, you realized you didn't know that much. But at 40, the magic happens. You finally understand that you don't need to know everything. You just need to know who you are. Think about it. Now you have experiences, stories, scars, and lessons that younger people can't even imagine. You've seen what works and what doesn't. You've achieved things and realized that some of them didn't matter that much after all. What would happen if, instead of resisting time, we learned to embrace it? Now is your chance to rewrite the rules, to trade expectations for authenticity, to stop pleasing others and start pleasing yourself, to stop merely existing and finally start living. What will you do with this new life you've just gained? The irony of all this is that we spend our youth trying to look older and our maturity trying to look younger, as if, at no moment, we are satisfied with who we are. As if happiness is always somewhere else, in another phase, in another version of ourselves. But what if we accepted that true life begins when we stop fighting the inevitable? When we stop trying to fit into meaningless patterns? When we understand that time doesn't steal anything from us, it only reveals what truly matters? Jung was right. The first half of life is about building. The second is about liberation. And the best part? You still have time to decide what you'll do with the next act of your story. Now tell me, will you keep fearing time, or will you finally use it to your advantage?